Good morning, everyone. I'm David Anderson, the program lead of the Healthy Landscapes program at FRI Research, and welcome to the third installment of our webinar Wednesdays. Today we have Tim Vinge giving a presentation on birds and bees and whether they like NRV. And Tim is with the Government of Alberta with Environment and Parks, and he is just about to embark on his master's at U of A with Dr. Scott Nielsen. Now, a little bit of housekeeping before I turn it over to Tim. We have turned all the cameras off, so you can't see anybody, and you'll only be able to see Tim's presentation. We've kept all of the microphones off. If you have questions during the presentation or at the end of it, use the chat or the questions box you have, and when we'll let Tim speak for about 20 minutes, and at the end I will turn my microphone back on and read your questions to Tim and have him answer them. The other thing is that we will be recording the presentation as we do with all of them, and when the question and answer starts, we'll be turning the video recording off. And I think we're almost ready to go, so with that I will turn it over to Tim. Take it away.
Yeah, good morning, everybody. I've been away for a while, and it's nice to be back. What I'd like to do first of all is just roll a few credits here, if I might. There's been a lot of people that have been involved in putting this project together. First of all, I'd like to thank FRI for this opportunity and for putting this on today. It's a great piece of technology. This work was carried out in 2016 and 17. The project sponsor was Scott Milligan in Environment and Parks here in Alberta. I'd also like to recognize the people whose names appear on the bottom of the slide. They were all instrumentally involved in working on this project in one sort or another, in one way or another. Kate Lindsay was the project lead for this work, and she actually got the original funding that went to FRI for some of the first work that was carried out under this program. And lastly, I'd like to thank all of you for taking your time out of your busy day this morning to hear what we have to say. And lastly, but not leastly, some people have called me the acronym king, and of course I've got an acronym for you already. This is the only one. It's called the BURNS. That's the acronym we gave this program when we started it here in the beginning of 2016, and it stands for Biodiversity Using the Range of Natural Disturbance Strategically, or BURNS 1. Okay. The outline, I'm going to talk very briefly about the study area and then get more into the approach. I'm going to talk about NRV, how we use Dave's information for NRV for the ALPAC forest. And I'm also going to talk about this whole business of resiliency. And we've developed an approach to hopefully look at resiliency of species over the planning horizon. I'll talk about some key findings, and then at the end we'll have a robust discussion. Okay, I wanted to clear up a few terms to start with that I use interchangeably, and when I talk about the active landscape, it is the same as the managed landscape or the harvestable landscape. So those words can be used interchangeably throughout the presentation, just because different people had a hand at the modeling and different portions of this. So the passive landscape is really the non-managed landscape or the wetlands portion. The total landscape, of course, being the active plus the passive landscape, both of those rolled together. In one of the scenarios, we did introduce a fire, and we selected a historical fire, the House River fire, just to put into one of the scenarios to see what the impact would be in that scenario in terms of NRV. This area is located in the South Athabasca, in the southern portion of ALPAC's FMA. There was a regional strategic assessment completed on this area too by the government of Alberta. So they went in and did a report, which I can get for anybody that's interested in that work that was done to basically describe this landscape, the complexity. And you'll notice in terms of the table, the passive landscape, there is a good proportion of this landscape that is considered to be passive. And that will weigh in affecting our ability to reach NRV. And the other thing I've finished this slide with is that that different landscapes would have reacted differently to our ability to getting to NRV. So this information is particular to this landscape, but if we're in the foothills, the results might be somewhat different. Okay, just a quick flow diagram. What we set out to do was to develop a methodology for transforming landscapes from their current state to some type of a future state that we determined to be NRV. Dave was the one that gave us our, had built an NRV forest to determine an NRV forest for the ALPAC FMA. We wanted to disturb the landscape with harvesting, with natural pattern harvesting, and we wanted to have a look at the ability of different harvesting scenarios to get us to or within NRV. We also wanted to model these changes over time to see how they affect. We selected some indicators, tier level 3 from the biodiversity management framework. When I say biodiversity, I'm not suggesting that what we selected is representative totally of all biodiversity. It is some indicators we selected to be able to track the impacts of our different scenarios. We used the time to reach NRV. You can see in the slide we've got different time scenarios to get to NRV. The model we used was Patchworks to help us get to NRV. And what we did is we optimized the model on getting to NRV. So there's everything else are outputs of the model getting to NRV, and including some of the habitats that were available and the cuts and all those other things. So I wanted to mention that we didn't optimize for cut. Okay, biodiversity indicators. Here's our list on the left. We had a real range of indicators, and they were selected by Margaret Donnelly from the ALPAC, and Margaret did a lot of work on this. They represent a cross-section of species in the seral stages. So when you look at the top chart, you'll see old, mid, young in terms of seral stage, and along the bottom we have our species groups: pine, spruce, mixedwood, and aspen. We didn't use any of the tier 1 or tier 2 indicators from the BMF because we wanted to select indicators that we thought would be more responsive to some of the landscape changes in the scenarios. The graph on the bottom we got from the Alberta Biodiversity Monitoring Institute and their relative abundance, species relative abundance graphs. And we had one of these for each one of our indicators that you see listed up in the top. Okay. And I'll be getting into more about these relative abundance graphs later on in the presentation. So, okay, let's talk about some of the key timber supply findings. Notice on the right, we have the list of the scenarios, and you'll see some of them say total NRV as soon as possible, total NRV, and other ones say active. So the active basically were scenarios run on just the active part of the landscape, whereas the total landscape encompassed the non-active plus the active. The allowable cut that Patchworks determined for this area was 1.5 million cubic meters, as indicated by the black dotted line. We ran a scenario shown by the yellow square, I guess, is we wanted to reach NRV as soon as possible. And we told the model it had to surge cut in the first 10 years to reach NRV. It did, but the cut levels, 5.5 million cubic meters in 10 years was a little bit unrealistic. But just the same, it's one of the scenarios we ran. Okay. Then the rest of the scenarios that we ran on the total plus active landscape, we constrained we allowed the cut to go increase by 20%. So the blue area represents when we reached NRV by allowing the model to increase the cut by a level of 20%. Okay. So the NRV AAC was 800,000 cubic meters. So we went from 1.5 million to 800,000, which represented a 47% drop in AAC. But the thing is, we didn't optimize for cut. If we would have optimized for cut and an NRV, this would have been slightly different. And don't forget, we've got a fire in here as well. So there's a bunch of things. We've got surge cuts in here. So there's different factors that are influencing those cut levels. In order to determine an average NRV AAC, what we did is what Bob did, Bob Christian with Forestry Corps. He averaged every three periods, every 3 20-year periods to get a cut level. We measured success against NRV targets developed for the ALPAC FMA again. I mentioned that Dave had given those to us, and he had done a lot of work on that, both of the active and total landscape. Fire here is represented by the red bar that I'm showing in the graph. That's that House River fire, and you can see things jumping around a little bit after that fire. Variance in the harvest. Once the model reached NRV, the range was somewhere between 50,000 and 1.5 million cubic meters. So the model was working to try and maintain the harvest so that we kept the landscape in an NRV format. Okay, so the first graph basically shows, I'll explain this. If you look at the bottom, you'll see the cover groups or cover types, pine, spruce, aspen, and so on. And then we have the cereal stage, young, immature, mature, and old. These cereal breaks were determined by ALPAC as a part of their growth and yield program. And the light blue color, it represents the NRV range that was determined from David's runs that he did in the Neptune program. And then the dark blue represents the current state of the landscape in terms of the percent in that particular species and maturity class. Just to give you an indication of the complexity, we modeled 14 different species, 10 different scenarios, 2 different landscapes, managed and active, and in patchwork. So we had a lot of different combinations that we explored here. We really looked at the range. So as an example here, for spruce mature, okay, the range, the NRV range that was determined by David was from 7 to 31% for that class. The dark blue bar indicates that there was a total of about 65% of the landscape in that spruce mature class. Our planning periods we used, and this again I mentioned, were 20 years. So every 20 years the model would output information associated with these maturity classes, and which we use to evaluate habitat. This next graph is just a different representation of NRV once again, but it just shows you the species types down the left-hand side and maturity classes across the top. There's 16 of these, and I'm gonna zero in on one of these so you can see actually what it looks like. But the bands, the blue bands, represent the NRV bands that were determined in the previous graph, only shown in a different different representation. So let's have a look at one of these. The percent of the area is indicated on the y-axis, while the scenarios are indicated on the x-axis. So here's a list of the active, and then the ones that were the other ones on the total landscape. And what the small circles in the bottom, the colored circles represent movement of those forests in terms of the percent of the landscape that was within NRV. The plus on the graph indicates where the landscapes actually started when we started modeling. And again, the blue band is considered to be within the NRV for stand type and serial stage. Remember that some scenarios are only for getting to NRV on the active landscape, and I mentioned that earlier. And what we found was that it's much easier. If you look over on the right-hand side on the active landscape on the graph, you'll see that it's a lot easier for the model to get to NRV and stay within NRV if we just looked at the active landscape. And but it became much more difficult when we included the passive landscape, because we're not really managing anything to do with the passive landscape except for the fire that we introduced as a part of this work. So you'll see some of the circles coming out of NRV. So the model is having to keep all of these 16 cover type and serial stage within NRV. So it's quite a challenge for the model. Okay, I wanted to talk about where we ended up with how successful we were, I guess, with obtaining NRV. The left-hand side is sort of the years into the future, so you look at it as a planning horizon. The scenarios are along the top of the graph. Represents a planning horizon of 180 years on the left-hand side. Based on the preliminary patchwork runs, we determined that the most realistic target for reaching NRV on the scenarios was 55%. If we tried to increase that, we ended up not being able to reach NRV very much of the time. And so we described 55% as being of 55% of the strata, serial strata, being within NRV as our NRV state. And remember that Patchworks, I mentioned, is trying to keep all 16 of those strata in NRV, so it's quite a challenge. But for our max harvest with fire and our active NRV as soon as possible, you can see the green portions. We were able to be within NRV for quite a good portion of the planning horizon. So key biodiversity findings. Let's talk about this resiliency business. What did we consider for resiliency? Well, what we did is we used the ABMI relative abundance graphs. We developed a scoring concept, and it's on the bottom in the table that you see on the bottom, and that relates to the high, medium, and low categories in the table. So the scoring is in relation to stand type and serial stage. Relative abundance values were derived from for these graphs have been derived by from the ABMI sample plots. Resiliency scores were developed based on dividing the probability scores, okay, so those bars, or the scores on the left, into 3 categories based on the highest frequency bar on the graph. We arbitrarily designed them into 3. Then we assigned a 3-to-1 scoring for the probabilities. Now, you could say or argue that some of those lines could be a little higher or a little lower. That's fine. But they're the same for all of our scenarios. So if they're a little bit incorrect or incorrect, they're incorrect for everything. And so we're making the same comparisons. But it is a relatively interesting concept to be able to start to divide those habitats by serial stage and species, and start to zero in a little more about the habitat quality. Okay. The patchwork outputs that we had every 20 years gave us a summary by serial stage, number of hectares, by cover type. and serial stage. I was able to weight these scores that you see here by using the system to come up with an average resiliency habitat score for each species. And then the scores could be, you could have individual species scores, or you could roll them up to the landscape level for all species. And I'll be talking a little more about the resiliency, this resiliency business. This is an example of resiliency or / habitat, we could say, scores over the planning horizon. And the x-axis is the year. The y-axis is the resiliency score. The species are represented by the different line colors and points on the graph. So if you look at the bottom, we have alder flycatcher, brown creeper, barred owl, and so on for each one of those lines. I'm not going to go into a lot of detail on these because they're very complicated, and we had many of these graphs for each scenario. This one was for scenario 1001, gross NRV as soon as possible on the total landscape, and using resilient scores weighted by cover type and serial stage. The two squares represent our NRV portions, which is interesting as well. One particular point on the graph is not necessarily significant. To me, resiliency represents all of the individual habitat scores across a period of time and how they change. So it's a time-bound concept. Species sensitivity really is a function of how the habitat scores decline, how long do they decline for, and how fast do they recover, in my mind. All of these represent the resiliency concept. The starting point over on the left-hand side is not a target for us. Reaching NRV under the particular scenario was our target. Again, so these all become outputs. The habitat scores or resiliency trends were outputs from achieving NRV through the different scenarios. And what was kind of interesting is that you could start to group the species into categories. So down here we have our specialists. In the middle we have our more generalist species that use a greater portion of the landscape. And up at the top we have some of the species, more abundant species, maybe more abundant habitats. But we're starting to see things sort of start to group, which I found quite interesting. So this is an example from the relative abundance graphs of a very abundant species, marten. And every one of those serial stage or ages and cover types have got quite a high score for relative abundance. And if you look over on the right-hand side, we calculated what that graph actually meant for a score based on high, medium, and high medium scores, and it came out to a 2.8 for scenario 1001. So again, we had different scenarios, and we had different scores for different species. So that's a relatively abundant species. And on the other hand, we've got low resiliency ratings for Canada warbler. They're what I would call a more specialist type of a species, and they like over mature deciduous species for the most part. And their resiliency score was 1.08 for scenario 1001. So again, you can see things starting to sort themselves out based on applying the application of these resiliency scores weighted by each period by the serial stage. Kind of interesting. So the other thing I wanted to do was play around with the data a little bit. And again, I lied to you at the beginning because I have one more acronym for you. Sorry. The learned calculator stands for landscape evaluation, applied range of natural disturbance. So what I did was I developed a calculator that allows you to go in, if you know what types of species and serial stage species like, what you can do is, or don't like, what you can do is go in and reduce or increase these numbers on the right-hand side. 0.7, I reduced over mature pine by 0.7 and black spruce for 0.7. And you could add the 0.3 back into the establishment side. I didn't do it in this example, but you can't just, it doesn't evaporate. The area has to go back in and start all over again. But it allows you to play in a calculator sense with biodiversity, which is kind of interesting. So what I did then, this is a results matrix showing the species on the left side and the scenarios all along the top. And as I play with the calculator, these values change in relation to how I manipulate the calculator. The resiliency scores and the percent change you see is from the starting resiliency point, are both indicated in the table. The dark red indicates a higher percentage of change. So the minus 30, the minus 24. So if you see Hermit Thrush, we're going to take a closer look at that one. When you look at that, you might assume, uh-oh, we got to do something different here. We've got some serial stage or some serial stage and cover type must be really creating a problem. Maybe we're over harvesting in one serial stage. But it allows you to have that discussion, and then you can go in the calculator and tell the story. What you can do is try and go and fix that by going in and changing those and weighting those areas in the calculator. My experience with working with the calculator showed that the landscape has a certain buffering capability. It surprised me. I was changing stuff and not seeing much of a change in the graph. So different amounts of high, medium, and low quality habitats are on the landscape, and it takes many units of poor habitat to equal 1 unit of good habitat. So if I take away one poor or one good piece of habitat, there still might be an abundance of poor and medium habitat available. So you don't see much of a change. All fine filter changes need to be considered in terms of the coarse filter effects. So every time I make a change in the calculator, it affects all these values. So you could take a nice quick look at the coarse filter effects of your changes in the landscape by making the calculator changes. This is changing the habitat to a more favorable condition for one species is really difficult to achieve, I found. When you take away from Peter to pay Paul, you take away from several Peters and very often pay Paul very little. Landscapes are hard to change on the spot. It's kind of like turn a super tanker on a dime. They take time to change and you have to know what you're doing. So there are these coarse filter implications for these fine filter changes. The other thing that I did was I just made a list from, in terms of the resiliency scores, from the highest to the lowest, so you could see where these particular species ended up. And what you can do is you can start to group them again based on ones that are fairly abundant, have a relatively high relative abundance and resiliency score, and ones in the middle, and then ones that have a very low score. This starts to tell the story about your landscape and the disturbance of your habitat. And how resiliency scores do change over time as your habitat changes or as you disturb the landscape. In those different scenarios, we disturb the landscape differently. You see them at the top. There's a few examples, and you can when you run across, you can see there's some subtle differences in the actual resiliency scores, but they seem to remain quite close together, I guess, as you move across, right? So I'm going to pick one, Hermit Thrush. I mentioned it a bit earlier, I think. They really like, we showed it as being in trouble in my calculator or in my summary slide there. They really like younger cereal vegetation, and this one really caught us by surprise. We thought we were losing this one because of what we were doing, and in reality, we were losing it because of what we weren't doing in the passive landscape. And basically, as that passive landscape in the model got older and older, the value of that habitat decreased over time, and we were getting into we were having some problems with trying to maintain that species habitat for, especially in black spruce and larch, because that's a big part of the landscape that we don't manage, right? So then what I did, this is the second last graph. I combined an area representation of cereal stage and the resiliency scores. So the resiliency score is on the right-hand side for Hermit Thrush. And these are area graphs showing the amount of cereal stage that we see throughout the planting period. The purple represents a real increase in over mature black spruce until the model starts to kill it off. So that the die-off is an architect of the model right now, and maybe a bit of an architect of the fire, which you can see as the red bar. Things do bounce around a little bit after the fire. And so the graph shows Hermit Thrush in relation to cereal stage and resiliency values. As the amount of the overmature black spruce increases on the landscape, there is a decrease in resiliency scores for this species. So that what it tells you is that you have to be careful when you're making inferences about why species are increasing or decreasing. And a good friend of mine said to me one time, you have to be able to tell the story, Tim. And things like these graphs, I think, do help us tell the story about what's happening out there. And we're not just inferring that it's us, or it is us in one way or another. But the other point I wanted to make, finish off on this slide, is the cereal pinch points. So, you know, we don't know right now, but in this period, we do have quite a cereal pinch point, and that is as our species resiliency is decreasing. And so that's telling us something. Those pinch points are important. And if we know how those are going to affect us in the future, what we could do is we could be doing some management earlier on down here to make some improvements so that we don't have those pinch points. So this is all about crystal ball gazing and knowing that a species is maybe close to the precipice before it is close to the precipice, and we can make some adjustments. Sometimes with our monitoring, we don't know that we've got a problem until we've got a real problem. And what we have to start to be able to do as managers, forest managers and land managers, is come together as biologists and foresters and ecologists and come up with a system so that we can start to evaluate all of these disturbances on the landscape, and so that we can manage, so that we can initiate management strategies today that are going to deal with problems that aren't going to show up for 20 years, in my mind. So do the birds and the bees like NRV? Well, I'm thinking that they do. I think depending on the way we leave that landscape, the condition of that landscape, the patchwork of that landscape, the variety of stand types and cereal stages, I think the more, the literature says anyways, the more that we can leave that variety. Variety is the spice of life. And as this forest is, I would be thinking that these species would be very happy. I put a couple of quotes here just to support this ecosystem business and this NRV business. The one comes from the United Nations, the FAO, and it says the ecosystem-based forest management focuses on levels of biological organization which encompass the essential structure, process, and functions and interactions. Those are all important words among organisms and their environment. Biodiversity management framework says long-term ecosystem health and resiliency are sustained with consideration of natural disturbance patterns and processes. So I'd like to thank you all for sitting in on the presentation today, and I'm looking forward to answering your questions. And I've got the presentation will be available, as Terry said, after. And I guess I'll leave it there. Thanks, everybody.